welcome to this section of Words Festival. We're thrilled to be here. Welcome to its next great event, the 2016 James Reaney Memorial Lecture. It is an honor, my honor, to introduce, I'm going to call you a Canadian icon. Can you stand that? A Canadian icon, John Beckwith, a dear friend of my late parents. As the collaborator of longest standing with my late father, James Crerar, Jamie Reaney, John Beckwith is a wonderful member of the Memorial Lecture team. I am James Stuart Reaney, and it's a joy to see John Beckwith, and speaking of teams, to recall the time that this incredibly valuable Canadian cultural artifact, it's a baseball bat if you can't see it.
You stole one of my stories.
I stole one of his stories, but I can't.
I show you the rest.
Yes, that's right. Struck mighty Miltonic blows in baseball games matching the Beckwith and Reaney families. The James Reaney Memorial Lectures were first hosted by the Stratford Public Library. After my father's death, my late mother, London's greatest poet, Colleen Thibodeau, and the Stratford Library's Sam Coughlin, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but Sam was here in London for many years as well, devised an annual fall event to honor Dad's memory in Stratford, near where he was born in Perth County. My mother gave the first lecture, and so you can see we set the bar high. Keeping up with that lofty beginning, there's been an all-star lineup. Marion Johnson, who's here. Marion, are you? Marion Johnson and Peter Denny were there, and they had a dramatic presentation, which I think included Jason Ripp was in the cast. Was Jason in the cast for that one, Marion, I think? No, who wasn't the, who? It wasn't Jason Ripp. Well, it was better than Jason Ripp. That's why I don't remember it properly. Jean Mackay played fiddle at her event, which was fantastic. And Jean is here as well. Jean, can we recognize you? There's Jean, fantastic. David Ferry, great Canadian actor. He illuminated dramas and scripts from his perspective on and off stage during many works with my father. Tim Inkster gave a marvelous lesson on type and typography, and in that year, I think we moved over to a Stratford ice cream parlor to hold it. It was very classy. And then last year, Tom Gary helped me understand at last my father's emblem poems. And I'll say, at the end of each one of these lectures, I've always said, I did not know that about my parents. I learned something from these, and I know you will too. John has promised a tell-all session, so we're doing that. He was at Tom's lecture in 2016, and he promised to make us all sing during this lecture. And again, I don't want to spoil things. In the time between, the lecture has moved from Stratford to London, where we lived after 1960. Those of us who helped maintain the James Reaney legacy are grateful to the Stratford Public Library for nurturing the lecture series' first years, and to Carolyn Doyle and Rebecca Faber in the London Public Library for embracing it here and, of course, helping make it part of the Words Festival. As anyone who's read this amazing... Oh! They're adding stuff to my script, but that's... Tom Smart is in the house. Tom, please, I did have you in there, but please stand up. Tom Smart, he'll be here next year, all being well, 2017. I'm going to just skip over the rest of it. Does anybody else need to interject anything before I... Help me out? I just flew in from Arva. My arms were really tired. But to tell us about the creative partnership, and to, I think, probably tell me when you first met my father, and I know the collaboration continued into the 2000s, and much else, here is John Beckwith. With failing hands, John, to you I pass the baton.
To accompany his 2001 article about Branwell Bronte in the journal Bronte Studies, James Reaney contributed the following brief biographical note, quote, James Reaney at 14 was sent to market to sell potatoes. earned more than enough to buy a cheap copy of Wuthering Heights, and life was never the same. Writing for a history of the Guelph Spring Festival a decade or so earlier, 1992, he said, quote, "My experiences of opera were scrubbing kitchen floors on Saturday." His kitchen apparently had more than one floor. And hearing the Met broadcasts as I did. These references evoke the persona Reaney created for himself, now so familiar to his readers. The figure of a Southwest Ontario farm boy who, as likely as not, on breaks from his potato marketing or his scrubbing, enjoyed a cup of tea accompanied by a slice of bread sprinkled with brown sugar. See the preface to the reprint of Anne Cardwell's novel Crazy to Kill. Such reminders frequently occur in the work of the sophisticated adult Reaney. Jamie and I met in the late 1940s as undergraduates at the University of Toronto. I had a strong interest in literature, and especially theater, and he was very keen about music, so we became close friends. We sometimes played piano duets together, attended student get-togethers, concerts, plays. I accompanied him to many of the movie replays he was so fond of. He would find that Oliver Twist was showing on some suburban screen, a film he'd already seen a dozen times, but had to see again. At least once we attended two films on the same day, Chaplin's City Lights in the afternoon and Olivier's Hamlet in the evening. Through him, I became part of a university literary scene and developed further valuable friendships. It was inevitable we should consider some sort of collaboration. He loaned me a typescript of The Red Heart, the poetry collection which, when published, earned him his first Governor General's Award. The plums are blue pendulums that thrum the gold-wired winds of summer. The original lines I loved and memorized are slightly different. That passage has a musical resonance, but I didn't feel moved to actually set it to music. I relished the beginning and end of another poem, Scenes for a Stereoscope, and recited them in my head many times. By the seesaw shore walks a tall man who looks at the sea and says, "O sea, as you forever seesaw, where is my Marjorie Daw?" And the sea replies, "Haw, haw, you will never find your Marjorie Daw, but must go back to your wife for the rest of, haw, haw, the rest and remainder of your life." Again, there's a musical beat at those nice syncopations and repetitions, but it was my feeling that singing the words would not be any kind of useful enhancement or amplification. However, I was stimulated in a more active way by the 6 poems of the Great Lakes Suite, another inclusion in that 1949 collection. And with Jamie's permission, I made them into a chamber cycle for 2 voices and 3 instruments. It has been performed and broadcast many times over the years. Sad to say, there is no commercial recording. It marks an advance in my development as a composer and was, I think, my first artistic encounter with my Canadian surroundings and background, an encounter that opened a significant chapter in my work, for which I've always been tremendously grateful to Jamie. We kept in touch, though no longer living in the same town. Colleen once wrote a short play about a family visit to the Reaneys, by the Reaneys to our home in Toronto. And one summer, with our children, we gathered, as James has been suggesting, for a hilarious softball game on a sand dune near Godrich. No one who attended can forget James Stewart calling out, "No, Dad, you hit the bat at the other end." I'm not sure who the individual characters are. That may be Jamie with his back to the camera. Reaney's abilities in music and the effect of music on his creative work have, in my opinion, not received the recognition they deserve. Growing up in Stratford, he studied piano and music theory with Cora Bell Ahrens, 1891 to 1964, whose teaching and original publications earned her a distinguished reputation throughout Canada. If students in the mid-20th century didn't attend lessons and classes in her studio, they at least knew the pedagogy text and the harmony and sight-reading manuals of the author with the musical initials CBA. Under her guidance, Reaney followed the Toronto Conservatory piano exam syllabus up to its penultimate level, grade 10. He was a collaborator with whom I felt I could discuss musical values, one for whom the musical vocabulary was familiar ground more than it is, let's say, for the average casual listener or lover of music. In his poetic cycle about Stratford, 12 Letters to a Small Town, Jamie paid tribute to Cora Ahrens in the 8th letter, subtitled The Music Lesson. The cycle was a CBC radio commission for which I was the collaborating composer, and I therefore had input in several of the poems, including this one. It depicts a piano lesson in which the student, after playing a few exercises and a set piece called The Storm, is asked to display his progress on another piece called A Year in the Town by playing each of the 4 sections, representing the 4 seasons, first one hand at a time and then with both hands together. Both The Storm and A Year in the Town have appropriate spoken texts to which the music corresponds. Although the published 12 Letters clearly indicates it's a collaborative work, several reviewers dismissed the music lesson sequence as the ultimate in modernist nonsense.
At my music teacher's house at the back, there was a railway track with trains going by. In dreams, the engine of the train always stands still and starts going off on the scale with a big blast on a steam whistle. After waiting in the hallway with the Fathers of Confederation, the history of the Dutch Republic, pictures of Greek statues, interestingly disfigured, and de la Motte Fouquet's Fondine, gorgeously illustrated by Edmond Dulac. After that, the lesson.
Now I'll set the metronome.
I'm very far from home.
We have half an hour to play.
In a laudatory way.
Place your scales first, in the form of our town streets.
A Baptist minister walking up Nile Street.
An Arabian girl running down Douglas Street.
A French teacher on Wellington Street.
A Sunday school teacher on St. Patrick's Street.
A truant officer on Romeo Street.
An uppity type on Downey Street.
A Welshman on Britannia Street.
An Irishman on Caledonia Street.
Left the loo now. Now play me your pieces. Play me The Storm.
The Storm. A cloud and a cloud and a cloudy came into the blue afternoon room. A cloud and a cloud and a cloud and a cloud and a cloud. A cloud and a cloud, a cloud and a cloud and a cloudy.
Down, down, down came the cloudy, with a window pane shuttered and mirrors for your feet. People running into stores, darkness in the library, umbrellas blossom, churches nearer through the rain.
came out of the yellow garage. Joseph McCloud in a many-colored vest danced to the music dying in the west.
Yes, you hold hands together very nicely on that. Up the tempo now, and do keep practicing your snow scenes and interiors, your skylines and city limits. Let's have the next piece.
Two-part invention, A Year in the Town.
And how fast can you play it?
Not very fast.
Then you better play it hand separately. Left hand first.
Blossom, blossom, buddies, budding blossoms.
The right hand for that.
The spring winds up the town. The spring winds up the town.
Left hand now. Right hand.
Frog, stop. Put out the glass-winged lantern, tinkling summer on the porch. Frog, stop. Put out the glass-winged lantern, tinkling summer on the porch.
Left hand.
Twig and branch,
Faster.
twig and branch, bricks, stones and traffic hum. Twig and branch, bricks, stones and traffic hum. Twig and branch, bricks, stones and highway hum. Bricks, stones and far away. Twig and branch and twig.
The right hand for that now.
Crickets cry and the owl flies down. The Ferris wheel and the fall rains fall. Crickets cry and the owl flies down. The Ferris wheel and the fall rains fall.
And let's hear the left hand for winter.
Blue and white and blue, Orion rules the frosty town. Blue and white and blue, Orion rules the frosty town. Blue and white and blue, Orion rules the frosty town. Blue and white and blue, Orion rules the frosty town.
For 3 days, no train or car got into town. The bakers had their yeast dropped from an airplane.
Now, hands together, and not too fast, not too slow.
Spring.
The spring winds up the town. The spring winds up the town.
Summer.
Frog stop, put out the glass-winged lantern, tinkling summer in the porch. Frog stop, put out the glass-winged lantern, tinkling summer on the porch.
Fall.
Crickets cry and the owl flies down. The Ferris wheel and the fall rains fall. Crickets cry and the owl flies down. The Ferris wheel and the fall rains fall.
Winter.
Blue and white and blue, Orion rules
For
the
3 days, no train or car got into the town.
Orion rules the frosty town. Blue and white and blue.
The bakers had their yeast dropped from an airplane.
Blue and white and blue, Orion rules the frosty town.
Twice as fast next time.
12 letters. The wind instruments at the end represent the train going by, but I don't know if you caught that. 12 Letters to a Small Town was the second in a series of half a dozen radio collages, as we called them, which Jamie and I produced for CBC Radio between 1960 and 1967. They are informal and sometimes experimental pastings together of literary and musical ideas using small groups of voices and instruments. In the first two collages, the voices speak against music. In the later ones, They both speak speak and sing. The most ambitious of these efforts was the centennial collage trilogy Canada-Canada. Consisting of first an imaginary cross-Canada tour, second a trip north from Toronto and into the 19th century past, and finally a series of brief Canadian images, the last one being a hockey game. The next excerpt is the Newfoundland sequence from part 1, where the soprano, Mary Morrison, has to pretend she's an iceberg. In 1973, Jamie and I were commissioned by the Toronto Symphony Orchestra to write something for their children's series. The idea was a story for narrator and symphony orchestra. The standard piece in this genre, Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf, had much charm and some good tunes, and with a prominent personage as the narrator could always be counted on as an audience pleaser. But the orchestra had done it repeatedly and was looking for something different. Maybe, it was daringly suggested, something Canadian. Jamie entitled his story, All the Bees and All the Keys. He said he had always wanted to write about A, bees and beekeeping, and B, small-town Ontario marching bands. The work picks up where the much anthologized poem The Royal Visit from the Red Heart left off. Rivalry between two brass bands is sorted out by the intervention of the Queen Bee, enacting the part of a fairy godmother, and the result is performed during a state visit to the town by the Governor-General. All the keys were represented by the residents of originally 12 beehives, but I had to remind Jamie that the tonalities based on the 12 degrees of the chromatic scale could be either major or minor, so we had to have not 12 but 24 hives. He was fascinated by the idea of the special skill needed by clarinetists, trumpeters, and sometimes other wind instrumentalists, the skill of quick transposition. He went overboard in having the villainous bandmaster demand this of every auditioning player, and moreover into all the keys, and I went along with this fantasy. The beekeeper's talented but impoverished son auditions on, among other things, a dandelion horn, and is expected to play a sight passage a fourth higher than written. The piece has been done several times over the years by the TSO, and I made a chamber reduction which has also had a few performances. In 1981, Jamie returned to the town band theme in one of his urban community plays, theater pieces on local themes performed by casts of local amateurs. This is I the Parade, based on the career of the German-born bandmaster, composer, and entrepreneur Charles F. Thiele, and produced in Kitchener, the town where Thiele lived and where his Waterloo Music Company, a publisher and instrument maker, still survives. A pageant rather than a play, the piece at one point depicts a penniless band performing on, yes, dandelion horns. Our first opera predated all these ventures. We worked on it slowly through the mid-1950s, almost entirely by correspondence, while starting to raise families and work on tenure, he in Winnipeg and I in Toronto. No one seemed interested in staging it, but we were fortunate that CBC Radio offered a broadcast production and, encouraged by its success, repeated it the following year. In the season 1959 to 60, we were supported by a small committee of friends to raise funds for a live staging of our own. The painter, Louis de Niverville, had just had a successful exhibition at a Toronto gallery and joined our team as designer of the set and costumes. We used his image of the Cereus flower posed on one of the chairs in all our publicity. And the set, Mrs. Brown's kitchen parlor, was reproduced with an advance article in the Globe and Mail with some of the costume sketches superimposed. The high backs that de Niverville imagined for the chairs had to be reduced because they dwarfed the singers. In Harthouse Theatre's Evening with James Reaney and John Beckwith in April 1960, we created unintentionally an event, a happening. Robert Fulford's Daily Star Review described not only what occurred on stage, but also the kind of first night audience it attracted. A thick cluster of literary magazine editors, a good-sized clutch of poets, some scattered avant-garde musicians, a strong delegation from the groves of academe, and a fair sprinkling of experimental theater people. This created only two problems. The writers tended to talk during the instrumental passages, and the musicians sometimes indicated they didn't know what Reaney was talking about. In Toronto in 1960, Fulford said, the artistic life is normally lived in tight compartments, but last night was an historic exception. This evening consisted of a short brass work by me as a curtain raiser, and then a one-man mask performed unforgettably by Jamie himself. And after the intermission, our first opera, the one-act night-blooming Cereus. It was a departure from conventional opera fare, first in that all the sex and violence in the story happens before the curtain goes up. Second, the central character, played by a mezzo-soprano, is a pious old woman in a small Southwestern community, probably Shakespeare just down the road from Stratford. Third, the middle scene is a 15-minute solo for Mrs. Brown, depicting one by one various aspects of her lonely life, giving thanks for food, dishwashing, sweeping, sewing, watering her plants, and accompanying herself at the parlor harmonium in a hymn. There is a second hymn near the end, sung by Mrs. Brown and most of the other characters. I can credit Jamie for convincing me of the importance of hymnody in the lives of Canadians in earlier generations, and stimulating me to investigate the idiom of North American tune books and hymnals. Research and writing in this area later became one of my main academic preoccupations. Jamie's hymn texts and the Cereus plot itself display an outlook familiar from Christian devotion. Jamie stopped going to church in his early adult years, but later resumed. In an interview, he said he wasn't sure whether he qualified as a bona fide Christian. I stopped going to church and have never resumed, which makes us different. But I've never felt ready to reject the biblical or overtly Christian passages in this or our later collaborations. They belonged to the characters or they belonged to Jamie, and my job was to find the appropriate music for them. Regarding that much criticized domestic song cycle of Mrs. Brown, Jamie had some characteristic words. He said, "The people who want to dress up and drag their husbands in tuxedos to an opera were certainly not going to accept an aria about washing dishes." What a contrast to Debussy and Verdi, where Mélisande and Violetta have no houseplants to take care of and do not seem to have washed a dish in their life. The dishwashing song has a refrain: plate, cup, knife, fork, spoon, and jug, which is repeated for 5 verses each time with a different permutation of those nouns. Patricia Rideout, who made such a strong impression as Brown, said that refrain was the hardest part of memorizing her role. I could have made it harder by using corresponding permutations of 6 notes for each repeat, but fortunately that didn't occur to me. The dramatic point of the song is that the domestic chores keep reminding her of her long-lost daughter.
Now will my plate and cup be
Jamie's essay, An Evening with Babble and Doodle, in Canadian literature, he says that when I called for more variety of meter in the draft libretto of Night Blooming Cereus, he was, quote, galvanized into, at the time, and for me, incredible labors of counting syllables, making parallel lines exactly the same length, and finding good, clean, clear, and sonorous rhymes. From those fall nights, I date my birth as a craftsman in words. In the detailed critical commentary of Reaney's playwriting career in Craig Stewart Walker's The Buried Astrolabe, the author calls this libretto one of the most successful of Reaney's early works. Walker applies the musical terms rhythm and incantation to quoted passages from two of the early plays, The Killdeer and The Easter Egg. About the speech of Mrs. Budge in Act 2 of The Killdeer, The River of Time, he writes that the character suddenly finds herself bursting into inspired lyricism. Actually, in the original production under Pamela Terry's direction, Budge sang those lines, and I can testify having created the music for the show. The hymn tunes in Cereus are my own invention, imitating the North American Protestant hymn style. Jamie had convinced me that this style was widely familiar in earlier days, a form of pop melody, in fact. So I decided my background score for The Killdeer would consist of variations on a hymn tune, this time an existing tune rather than a made-up one. It's called Blessed Name, and I got it from a gospel collection edited by Homer A. Roadheaver that Jamie lent me. This bit of musical borrowing had no religious intention. The melodic and rhythmic features simply seemed the right sort of vernacular for these Reaney characters and the locale and era of their stories. After the experience of Night Blooming Cereus, both Jamie and I were keen to work on another opera. In view of the bewilderment some people felt at the retrospective nature of Cereus, I said I thought the next one should be a fast-moving comedy. Jamie came up with a libretto based on the ancient marriage tradition of the Chivaree, or in North American lingo, Chivaree, a raucous tin pan serenade under the newlyweds' bedroom balcony, for which the groom is expected to pay a forfeit to the serenaders, who spend it on an alcoholic spree. The Chivaree is, in fact, the opera's title. Jamie had family lore relating to chivarees enacted in Stratford in his growing up days. In our premiere production, we didn't go so far as the buzzsaw he remembered from some of these real events, but the outsized auto horn, horse harness jingle bells, and resonant frying pan from that premiere will give you the flavor. Daisy, tired of waiting for her shy bookworm boyfriend Jonathan to propose, has agreed to marry the village moneybags, 58-year-old William Quartz. As the chivalry troupe gathers, Jonathan elects to join them, and together they manage to rescue Daisy before the union is consummated. It is then discovered that Quartz has inscribed his first wife's name in the register instead of Daisy's, so the marriage is invalid. Jamie is recalled as a mythopoetic disciple of Fry. If Quartz is Bluebeard, Daisy, carried away to hell by this monster, is Persephone, and Jonathan, who accompanies himself on a soft guitar in contrast to the loud Chivaree band, is Orpheus. For my part, I imagine classical opera models for Miss Beach, the Queen of the Night, and the hired man Ned, Despina. The band makes 3 successive tries at rousing chords. I heard these Chivaree music 1, 2, and 3 as variations on a familiar vamping routine of Tin Pan Alley days. I just show you. Here we'll hear the first burst of Chivaree noise. After that first burst, Quartz disperses the band with his shotgun, and Jonathan is heard with faint sounds from his guitar. He persuades the band to give it another try, and rousing Quartz again, they draw him away by warning him that a gypsy troupe has invaded his property. It gives Jonathan a chance to sing to Daisy, but with Quartz again in charge after the false gypsy alarm, Jonathan joins the Chivareers in a threat to burn Quartz's barn, and their third serenade ends with a shout of fire. For our next operatic collaboration, Crazy to Kill, we were fortunate to have our first commission from the Guelph Spring Festival. When we were approached by the Guelph organization, Jamie suggested two possible ideas, one based on the Children of Peace sect in early 19th century Ontario, and the other adapted from a detective novel published in Stratford around 1940. I had just finished a couple of other works focused on the Children of Peace, so I favored the second idea. Jamie eventually completed the Children of Peace libretto, and it was set to music by Harry Summers under the title Serenette. The detective novel Crazy to Kill by Anne Cardwell concerns a gory series of murders in a mental institution. The Guelph Commission was for a modest cast and instrumental backing. We fast-talked them into allowing us slightly more than the originally envisioned 2 singers and a piano. Our piece called for 3 singers, 2 actors, plus piano, percussion, and a certain amount of pre-recorded sound. The cast of the story is, of course, much larger, more than 20 individual roles. Jamie's concept, based on some of his other theatre works, was to have each live performer handle several roles with the aid of doll puppets. A gifted puppeteer, Anna Wagner-Ott, created 18 doll puppets, about 2/3 life-size, but light enough to be manipulated by the performers. Jamie, with his wizardly stage sense, envisioned among the doll puppets some representing characters that are also played by live performers. This led to interesting situations where the audience had to imagine the baritone as a live police detective conversing with a doll puppet as another police detective, and then the reverse, or the live Agatha transforming into Agatha the doll puppet and having her face slapped by a live nurse. In one of the murder scenes, the baritone sings falsetto the lines of the nurse, Miss Curry, actually a police spy, while holding the Curry doll puppet. Miss Curry, at the start of the scene, is depicted as settling Agatha Lawson and another patient, the eccentric francophone Madame Dupont. Can we move on to the next slide? Yeah. And the next one? These show you some of the puppets along with the live performers. The next one. This is the costume sketch of Sue LePage for Madame Dupont. In the beginning of this little musical excerpt, murder scene, in fact, the detective sings falsetto, but then when he gets really quite firm with his patient, he forgets that he's the nurse and he goes into his baritone voice. So.
Because there was
Jamie paid tribute to Harry Summers in his notes on Serenade and said how he had enjoyed having no rewrites, and no doubt unconscious reference to his work with me. With unparalleled success of Serenade in its run at the historic Sheridan Temple in 1990, John Miller, manager of that production and Jamie's agent at the time, proposed making it the first of a trilogy of operatic works on Ontario history. Serenade treated a crisis period in the Toronto of the 1830s. The second opera would be a prequel based on the founding of the city, and the concluding piece would have William Lyon Mackenzie as its main character. The Mackenzie opera was, in fact, never written. Jamie spent a long period researching for the second piece, the Simcoe Diaries, and consulting with archivists at Fort York, and produced what I always thought was one of his finest scripts, Tap 2. The title refers to the evening bugle call that signals the return to barracks of carousing troops, a signal that grew into a musical performance known as the tattoo. Jamie's researches extended to the musical habits and usages of Upper Canadians in those pioneer years. The script, I was surprised to learn, was rejected by 2 other composers before Miller offered it to me. I worked on it with Jamie for over a year, and we had a good tryout before an invited audience. But funding for a full-scale stage production was elusive, partly because the economic scene of the later 1990s wasn't as favorable for the arts as it had been a few years earlier. Eventually, Tap 2 did reach the stage once in Montreal with modified instrumental support, and twice in Toronto with the intended orchestration. In a poster for the 2003 Toronto production, we used this photo that Kathleen and I took at Fort George in Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is the site of most of Act 2 of the opera. It's the longest and most demanding of our operas. The first of its 2 acts depicts John Graves Simcoe as a major in the British force during the American War of Independence, while the second moves ahead in time to portray him in the founding of Fort York, which at the final curtain is a fragile town under threat of the War of 1812. The narration is mainly handled by boy sopranos. In our initial tryout and in the downtown Toronto production, we had excellent children for these parts, although in the other stagings we had to accept slightly built young women singers, which proved disappointing, an unsatisfactory substitute for the intended vocal quality. With the knowledge of the locale and the historic period he had acquired, Jamie's libretto used numerous quotations from writings and proclamations, and similarly, my score quotes from over 20 musical sources: military tunes, tavern songs, hymn tunes, patriotic numbers of the period. The opening chorus echoes Yankee Doodle, and Simcoe sings his proclamation of the new town, 2 phrases from Rule Britannia. The treatment was quite different from our other operatic works. It resembled the mix of drama and familiar tunes found in the 18th century form of the ballad opera, and I took to calling Tap 2 a documentary ballad opera. The illustration that you will hear is an Act 2 duet for Elizabeth Simcoe and the Indigenous wife of our now grown-up narrator number 1. This piece was not part of the original libretto, but I urged Jamie to enlarge the roles of these 2 female characters, and he produced a fresh and beautiful text. Atta Hensik introduces elements of the Niagara area to the newly arrived governor's wife, 5 of them representing the 5 senses: sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. Mrs. Simcoe is reminded of elements from her life in England. When Atta Hensick wants to know if she and her husband will be invited to the Simcoe's ball, Mrs. Simcoe says only if they are properly married, at which Atta Hensick rather loses her cool. In Craig Walker's book, he writes of an unfinished opera called The House by the Churchyard. This reference comes from a publication of a fragment under that title taken from Jamie's sketches for a new stage work using the juvenile writings of the Brontes, Branwell and his three famous sisters. In the mid-1980s, Jamie and I had both visited the Bronte parsonage in Haworth, Yorkshire, the house by the churchyard of the title. And we had many discussions about this venture in which not only the stories but their authors would be portrayed. I began to receive from him bundles of new script, always with extensive additions to the already oversized cast and multiple scene changes. At length, he said, the piece was turning into another trilogy like the Donnellys. It was all fascinating, but hard to keep straight and hard to imagine as an opera, practically speaking. I told Jamie I felt unequal to the task and suggested he should consider making it a play. This he did, and as Zamorna, it was successfully staged by a student cast of George Brown College under David Ferry's direction. I was deeply impressed by it and hoped to see it revived. In 1992, we were invited to devise something in the style of our early radio collages for a University of Toronto symposium honoring Northrop Frye. This was In the Middle of Ordinary Noise, an Auditory Masque. It was produced at the symposium in the acoustically challenging venue of the Victoria College Chapel, and afterwards the script was published in the symposium proceedings. I was uncertain about the possibilities of a revival, but the live production in 2005 by the Toronto Mass Theatre in a program which also included one-man masque was encouragingly received. The title of the program was Masks for a Rainy Day. Ordinary Noise is a mix of music and words, with time mostly words by Frye and quotations from literature. I chose some of the literary quotes, and Jamie suggested several specific musical ones. An actor portrayed Frye, and we had a singer and 3 or 4 assorted instruments. I was eager to embark on another opera and found an attractive story set in Scotland, not Canada. Jamie liked it and sent me an original and lively draft scenario. I was unlucky, however, when I showed it to several potential producers. They didn't agree with me regarding its possibilities. Jamie and I had both said we weren't ready to start on such a venture without some assurance of a production. Then Jamie's illness was a further obstacle, so that idea remains just an idea. Though ours was a close friendship and we worked together on many schemes. I had hardly any knowledge of Jamie's life as a mentor to younger writers. In the late 1990s, my son Simon sent an 80-page original essay to various writers he knew, including Jamie, asking for their comments. The essay was a dark, often savagely satirical comment on modern-day living, presented in the character of Balthazar from Lawrence Durrell's Alexandria Quartet. Another writer he approached was Stephen Hayton, whose recent book, The Waking Comes Late, is the 2016 winner of the Governor-General's Award for Poetry. We were touched to discover that book is dedicated to Simon. Jamie's letter contained both praise and encouragement. His advice was that Simon should loosen things up and keep the physical structuring down, down, down. In the 30s, he said, Aldous Huxley used to do this well, and then he lost the knack. Keep a diary, he said he told Simon, and keep at it. Revised versions of the essay and other similar writings continued, but whether they were sent for publisher consideration, I can't be sure. Simon handled his writing with strict secrecy. In the early 2000s, Simon's depression defeated him. His passing was a great shock. Jamie sent us a drawing of Simon as a defiant fist, and we continue to display it alongside a couple of other artworks by Jamie in our living room. Jamie and Colleen attended the 2003 performances of Tap 2 at the University of Toronto. The University Monk Centre organized a program of discussions around the opera's topic, and Jamie and I both spoke. And Susan took this picture of us. I think it was Jamie's last visit to Toronto. Thank you very much.
In closing, let me say a couple of things. First, that was fabulous, and of course, I come away having learned a tremendous about my parents and about the arts in Canada. Thank you, John. That was fabulous. We're going to make way for Al Purdy, but I'm going to sneak in one question before we go. John, I understand that you seldom wear a tie. Seldom, if ever, wear a tie, and yet today...
I haven't worn a tie for 2 years. I had to put on one today in memory of Jamie because he never appeared in public without some wildly loud tie. This is mild by comparison.